when you personally hear about some kind of peace agreement or ceasefire agreement, like what does that look like for you? Does that look like ceasefire along the front lines where it is now? Or does that look like Ukraine withdrawing their forces? Or does that look like Russia going back to the international borders?
Um, a good question. A good question. I think about it once a week for 3 years.
Hmm.
Um, what I would say without any fear is that, in my own opinion, the question of Crimea, for example, is obvious. For me, it is Russian territory, and it has always been. And about the Donetsk, Lugansk, and all of those eastern Ukraine territories, um, I would I would say that, in my own opinion, the best salvation is to do it like they did it, Soviets and Americans, they did it in Korea not for 1945, when they said the fire line is the border and let's stop the war. And we decided to do that way. I think that's the best salvation nowadays. Um, and that's it. Like, the fire line is the ceasefire line. I think that's it.
Gotcha. Let me ask you another question because the statement you made, Crimea always has been Russian territory and it always will be. Why do you say that?
Because according to a history of last 100 years, it hasn't always been Russian. Obviously, it's authentically Tatarian person, Turk Tatarian person, person. Sorry, territory. It's authentically Tatarian territory, but in 19th century, after all of those Turkish-Russian wars, after 1877, this territory became Russian. And according to what Soviets, I'm quite anti-communist. I don't like Soviets, and I've never been into Soviet agenda. But what Soviets did, they just, like, it was one single country. They took Crimea in 50s. Khrushchev took Crimea and gave it to Ukraine in a system of, like, okay, we can imagine that Soviet Union is a house. Okay, we are roommates.
Sure.
What's your name? Could I ask your name?
Yeah, yeah. Bobby. What's your name?
Bobby. Ivan.
Ivan. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, Ivan and Bobby, we live in the same house, and we have like two pillows in my room and zero pillows in your room. And I give you a pillow, and I say, like, that's your pillow. Okay, you can leave it in your house and in your room, and we will live like this. But if we split in two separate flats, just like Soviets did in 1991, that's what happened with Crimea. We have to talk about whether this pillow is going to be mine after we split, or it's your pillow now, and what was happening during the breakup of the Soviets. The country was sold by the pound, and nobody really cared about whether this territory has to belong to Ukraine now, and what is the root of this belonging after the breakup of the Soviet Union, or should we take the territory back, which we gave to Ukrainian Soviet Republic while we were united country.
Sure, but
And
I think it just kind of goes against your logic because when you say, like for example, Crimea has always been Russian, but then you start off with a history that it was inhabited by, Crimean Tatars, it was under the control of the Ottoman Turks, right? And then at some point Russia like captured the territory. And then under Soviet Union, they transferred, ownership of Crimea to Ukraine, right, at the time. But, and then, from 1991 to 2014, like it was still, like under Ukraine and stuff. So, like, for me, like, it's just clear, as night and day that, like, it hasn't always been, like Russian territory, right? Um, and we can get into the history of like, for example, like why did the like the Russian RSFSR, transferred it to, to like Soviet Ukraine and stuff. Personally, like I think it was just the economics of
Yeah.
it, so for example, like maybe about it, but it costs a lot of money to essentially rebuild from World War II. So the idea was, they say like it was symbolic from Khrushchev because he had Ukrainian roots, but also was economic because each Soviet republic was in charge of of their own budget of like rebuilding after World War II and stuff. So like maybe so, maybe not. But but sure, in any case that they transferred it, and then after 1991, Russia and Ukraine, they came to an agreement where the Russian Navy could lease Sevastopol, right?
Yes, for sure.
So and so like I guess that's where I'm getting at. And I hear this perspective a lot, from a lot of Russians that, like this was always like Russian and we just had to, like take it back and stuff. Um, so I guess that's what I was curious about. Like, so like
Hmm.
I guess like what's your rebuttal to that?
Could you repeat? I didn't hear your last sentence.
Like what is your rebuttal? What is your opinion against that, if
Ah,
you have
uh,
any?
yeah. My simple opinion is that USSR was created in mess and blood and fear,
Hmm.
and it was broken up in the same situation. I don't have questions towards Ukrainians. In 1991, they had territory. They said, it's ours. You can do some stuff in Sevastopol. It's ours. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's a profitable thing for a new sovereign country. I
Hmm.
have a lot of questions to our post-Soviet government, Yeltsin's government, which I deeply hate. uh, we had to solve this situation not in 2014. We had to work with the question of Crimea wisely in 1991. We wasn't doing that because the country was in shit. The country was in mess, and my personal opinion that we had to get into another division of borders in 1991 according to Crimea, because in 19th century we fought for this territory against Ottomans, and uh, it was unwise and unclear for me decision to do this with Crimea. And another answer to your question, to your opinion, is that I've been in Crimea in 2017. I've spoken to a lot of people, and as far as I understood, my biased, unclear opinion as a person, uh, that's a will of people who live in Crimea. They do like the idea of being a part of Russia. Most of them, and I think it strikes a chord with their Crimean opinion nowadays. Not everybody, but still, I have some questions towards Bolsheviks, Soviets, and Yeltsin's government about Crimea more. That's it. That's it.
Gotcha. So something I kind of want to challenge you about, because you said that you went there and then generally most people that you talked to, supported being in Russia. And, like statistically that can be true because after 2014, those who certainly didn't want to be under Russia, left, right? I mean, it's just kind of like anywhere. For example, like in Ukraine, even prior to 2014, prior to Donetsk and Lugansk, right? You know, like there were, I guess like pro independence parties and then pro Russia parties, right? But when you take, but like I guess, like when, like you have separatist forces where the government of Ukraine is not in control of Donetsk and Lugansk anymore, that skews the numbers where like now the very pro Ukraine party is like,
Yes, for sure.
70, 80% instead of 50-50, right? So I think the same could be said for Crimea where because the thing is, Surveys and statistics before 2014, the numbers were about like 40% of Crimeans supported joining Russia, right? And
Oh,
then
really?
yeah, um,
Oh,
yeah, it was 40%. So like, understandably, after 2014, like people typically who don't want to live under Russian rule, they would just leave, right? So then, we can argue like, well, in that case, like, could it be more like, 60%? Maybe, possibly, but the thing is, when you have, so how do I get to the point here? So let me ask you this. 2014, what do you think about the Crimea referendum in 2014 after Russia took control?
ooh, look, we live in Eastern Europe. We live in Eastern Europe, so there's no sense of speaking about official referendums and elections and their figures. Obviously, mayor of Macedonian's capital is obviously not a democratically elected mayor. And the same thing in Poland, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus. And figures of referendums are clear lists for me. Like, I don't even care about them because they're obviously not true. Like, we don't even read into them. It was about the percentage of people who support the picture of Russian Crimea in Crimea was simply my own opinion and like things in the air I could smell. So I see your pre-position in this question and I agree with you. Obviously. So that's really it.
Gotcha.
But
Yeah,
the
I appreciate that because I think, in all honesty, man, like you're probably one of the first Russians on this site that I've heard even like say that like, yeah, like the referendum is just kind of like, it's bullshit. I mean,
obviously,
essentially we just took it just to take it because we can. Um, because the thing is, like, what I always say is, let's just say, for example, prior to 2014, it wasn't like 40% of Crimeans that supported being under like Russia. Let's just say hypothetically it was like 80%, right? Um, and what I always tell is, like, the problem is like the way that Russia did it was a clear and cut invasion. Um, and it was an invasion first and then referendum later that took magically somehow in like 2 weeks, where now it's like 90% of the votes, right? In which, by the way, I don't even believe the option to rejoin Ukraine was even in the ballot. It's usually either join Russia or become independent, but typically the become independent means join Russia in 10 years, right? Um, so, and the analogy I like to make is, there are other events like this that happen worldwide where there is international procedure, to have something like this happen, to have referendums happen, right? In a legal way, right? Where, for example, like, what do you know about Northern Ireland and Scotland?
I know not really much about Scotland. It's like a deep thing for me, which I'm not really in. I'm not ready to speak about Scotland,
Sure.
but I know some stuff about Northern Ireland situation, IRA stuff, and I've read some
Hmm.
things about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess like, for example, Scotland was the most recent example, but essentially Scotland, a majority of the Scottish population, they voted to submit, to the British Parliament, a chance to host a referendum where the people of Scotland could vote, right? Whether to have independence, or still remain within the United Kingdom, right?
Uh-huh.
And such events like that, they're internationally observed, right? Because you want like the voting process to be as fair as possible, and you don't want any fraud as much as possible, right? And at the end of the day, even though it was a very close call, there were more Scottish people that prefer to stay within the United Kingdom than Scottish people that wanted to become a separate country.
Yeah,
And there was no argument about whether, it was fair or unfair, right? Northern Ireland, for example, they had the same, like agreement where, because to recap on Irish history, basically when Ireland became a separate country from the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom kept Northern Ireland, right? And after a
yeah.
few decades of conflict, Northern Ireland, they reached an agreement with the United Kingdom and Ireland where they can remain a part of the United Kingdom. However, if they ever want to, well, first of all, like you can travel in between Ireland and Northern Ireland, like there's no border at all, right? And then second, if the people of Northern Ireland, if they want to have a referendum whether to, join the Republic of Ireland or remain in the United Kingdom, they can always vote to join Ireland, right? And it's totally within their option. And those are examples like in the top of my head where I can think of where this happens, right? Or for example, even the Falkland Islands, where it's disputed between United Kingdom and Argentina, right? And
Yeah,
it's the same thing. Or Sudan and South Sudan, and it's the same thing. Um, and the issue is with how Russia did it with Crimea. Is for example, they invaded first, and then they had a referendum, right? And they didn't allow any international observers, right? And they did the whole referendum, I think, in about like a week or 2 weeks, where realistically, this kind of process, um, like the legal framework it takes to achieve this, like takes a very long time. Like maybe, like in the case of like Scotland or Northern Ireland, it took about like a year, maybe more to come to fruition, right? And normally with these kind of referendums, there's always a debate between different political parties, right? But you didn't see that happen in Crimea because in Crimea, for instance, like were there any like debates between different political parties about we want to remain in Ukraine versus we want to remain in Russia? Was there any legal framework requested by the people of Crimea that sent forth to the Ukrainian parliament, like and the Russian parliament, about like we want to begin this process to decide the future of our state, essentially, right? And none of the legal framework or the political discourse just happened in Crimea because it wasn't really the point of Crimea. The point of it was just to essentially have Crimea once again belong to Russia, right? And furthermore, I am also going to say this because if I know you personally are not justifying it, but I guess people who generally would justify it is if you crack that door open, to take some kind of territory by force, you also leave another door open, where people will claim parts of your territory, because it was historically theirs. So let me ask you this, what do you know about the city of Hasshenwai?
Hashin, why?
Hasshenwai, right? So if you didn't know, it's an old Chinese name for the city of Vladivostok.
Ah, I don't know much about the history of Vladivostok.
Yeah, so it used to belong to China, and parts of territory over there in Russia, right, northern Manchuria, Vladivostok, like that, all of it used to be Chinese before the Russian Empire, I believe somewhere in the 19th century, I think as late as 19th century, they were expanding territory there. And it wasn't that long ago, I think a few years ago, the government of China and their president Xi Jinping they put out a map, like a map of China, where it not only included, for example, islands in the South China Sea, and a little bit parts of other countries, but it even included several parts of Russia, right? And although they
Mm,
didn't claim Vladivostok as theirs, what they did was they assigned, Vladivostok on the Chinese map, to rename it back to the original city's name of Hasshenwai, right? But I guess like if you use the narrative of, like every country should take back what used to be theirs, you leave the door open for China to taking back Vladivostok, right? You leave the door open to Finland taking back Karelia, right? Um, it's the it's and that's why it's that kind of logic, um, where like if you try to figure out a way to work for you, like it's going to work against you very fast.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. It's a good point. It's a really good point. You're
Mhm.
right. Yeah.
Whew.
Man, it was so good. Like, this is your best conversation, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
Oh yeah, dude. It was pretty good because what's surprising is he actually agreed with every point that I made, with every point that I made, like he conceded all of it, and then he's
yeah,
like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, okay." He started off with the narrative, well, like I think it's without question Crimea should belong to Russia because it's always been Russian territory.
yeah,
And then I got him to explain the history, and I'm like, man, by your own admission, it wasn't always
yeah,
Russian territory, right?
yeah,
Like it was other people's territory more than it was Russian territory, right? So, um, I don't know. Dude, it was a really good conversation, though.
yeah,
You 100% could use these in your videos.
yeah, man,
So,
it will be a separate video for sure.